Some people have a dark charm that hides something sinister beneath the surface. Drew Peterson was one of those people. A police sergeant, a husband 4 times over, a father, and a killer. This is the story of a man who thought his badge would protect him forever. A man who believed he was untouchable. A man who was wrong. But before we dive into this chilling tale, make sure you hit that subscribe button and comment down below what state you're watching from. We love hearing from our American Shadow family. Now, let's begin. Drew Peterson seemed like the kind of guy who had it all figured out. Born in 1954, he grew up in the Chicago suburbs, in a place called Bolingbrook, Illinois. By the time he reached adulthood, Drew had found his calling. He became a police officer. For over 30 years, Drew wore the badge. He rose through the ranks, eventually becoming a sergeant with the Bolingbrook Police Department. His colleagues knew him as confident, maybe even cocky. He had that swagger, that self-assured attitude that made some people admire him, and others deeply uncomfortable. But to the outside world, Drew Peterson looked like a success story, a respected officer, a family man. Except, Drew had a problem. He couldn't stay married. In 1974, at just 20 years old, Drew married his high school sweetheart, Carol Brown. They were young, optimistic, ready to build a life together. They had 2 sons, Stephen and Eric. But the marriage didn't last. By 1980, just 6 years in, Carol and Drew divorced. The reasons? Well, Carol would later say that Drew was controlling, possessive, that he had to know where she was at all times, that marriage for Carol felt more like a prison than a partnership. Still, they separated, and Drew moved on. Quickly. Too quickly, some might say. Just 2 years after divorcing Carol, Drew married again. This time it was Victoria Connolly. Vicky, as everyone called her. They seemed happy enough at first, but again, cracks began to show. Drew's need for control hadn't disappeared. In fact, it had gotten worse. Vicky would later describe living in fear. She said Drew would follow her, watch her, interrogate her about every move she made. The marriage became suffocating. In 1992, after 10 years together, Vicky filed for divorce. And in those divorce papers, she made a chilling claim. She said Drew had put a knife to her throat, that he had threatened to kill her, that she was terrified of what he might do. But here's the thing. Drew was a cop, a respected sergeant, and Vicky's claims? They went nowhere. No charges were filed. No investigation was launched. Drew Peterson walked away, untouched, and he was already looking for wife number 3. Enter Kathleen Savio. Kathy, to her friends. She was beautiful, with dark hair and a warm smile. She worked as an accountant. She was kind, responsible, loved by everyone who knew her. In 1992, the same year his divorce from Vicky was finalized, Drew married Kathy. They bought a house in Bolingbrook. They had 2 sons together, Thomas and Christopher. For a while, it seemed like maybe, just maybe, Drew had finally settled down. But that illusion didn't last long. By the early 2000s, the marriage was falling apart. Kathy had discovered that Drew was having an affair, and not just any affair. He was involved with a 17-year-old girl named Stacy. 17 years old. Kathy was devastated, humiliated, furious. She filed for divorce in 2002, and what followed was a bitter, ugly battle. Drew made it his mission to make Kathy's life hell. He would show up at her house unannounced. He would harass her. According to Kathy's friends and family, she lived in constant fear. She told them that Drew had threatened her, that he said he could kill her and make it look like an accident. Remember, Drew was a cop. He knew how crime scenes worked. He knew how to cover his tracks. And Kathy? Kathy knew she was in danger. She filed police reports, multiple police reports. She documented Drew's harassment, his threats, his violence. She went to court. She got an order of protection, but nothing stopped Drew Peterson. On March 1, 2004, Kathleen Savio's neighbors realized they hadn't seen her in a while. Concerned, they contacted her family. Kathy's sister and brother-in-law went to her house. When she didn't answer the door, they called the police. Officers arrived and entered the home. They found Kathy in her bathtub. She was dead. At first glance, it looked like an accident. Kathy was lying in a dry bathtub, her head at an awkward angle. There was a small gash on the back of her head. The initial theory? She had slipped, hit her head, and drowned in the tub. The water had since drained away. But here's where things get strange. Very strange. A coroner's jury, a panel of citizens who review suspicious deaths, ruled Kathy's death an accident. And Drew? He inherited everything. The house, the life insurance, the settlement from their divorce that was still being finalized. Drew Peterson had just become a wealthy man. Kathy's family was devastated. They didn't believe it was an accident. They couldn't believe it. Kathy had been terrified of Drew. She had told everyone he was going to kill her, and now she was dead, and it was being called an accident. But Drew was a cop, and his fellow officers? They didn't push too hard. The investigation was closed. Kathy was buried, and Drew moved on. 3 months after Kathy's death, Drew married wife number 4. Stacy Kales was just 19 years old when she married Drew Peterson in October of 2004. Drew was 50 years old, marrying a teenager. Stacy had known Drew since she was 16. He had been a mentor figure, a police officer who seemed powerful, protective. She was drawn to that. But after they married, after she moved into his home and became stepmother to his children, Stacy started to see a different side of Drew. She saw the control, the manipulation, the rage. Friends would later say that Stacy became withdrawn, that she seemed scared, that she wanted out but didn't know how to leave. And then, Stacy started talking. She started telling people something shocking, something that would eventually blow this entire case wide open. Stacy told a pastor, a close confidant, that on the night Kathleen Savio died, Drew had left their home. He took a change of clothes with him. He was gone for hours, and when he came back, he brought those clothes back, in a bag. He asked Stacy to help him, to wash the clothes, to keep quiet. Stacy said she believed Drew had killed Kathleen, and she was terrified she would be next. On October 28, 2007, Stacy Peterson disappeared. That morning, Drew called Stacy's family and told them she had left him. He said she'd run off with another man. He said she'd called him and told him she wanted a divorce, that she was leaving, that she didn't want to be found. But Stacy's family didn't believe him. Not for a second. Stacy would never abandon her children. She would never leave without telling anyone. This wasn't like her at all. They reported her missing. And suddenly, the entire nation was paying attention. The media descended on Bolingbrook. Drew Peterson's face was everywhere. And for a man who had just lost his wife, Drew seemed surprisingly calm, almost smug. He went on television. He gave interviews. He joked with reporters. He seemed to be enjoying the attention. At one point, he even said, "I'm not a suspect. I'm just a person of interest." He smirked when he said it. But behind the scenes, investigators were digging, and what they found was damning. They discovered Stacy's statements about the night Kathleen died. They re-interviewed Kathy's family, who had never stopped believing she was murdered. They looked into Drew's history, his pattern of abuse, his threats. And then, they did something unprecedented. They exhumed Kathleen Savio's body. In November of 2007, Kathleen Savio's body was exhumed and a second autopsy was performed. This time, a different conclusion was reached. Kathleen hadn't drowned. She had been murdered. The new autopsy revealed that Kathleen had been beaten before she died. There were bruises on her body consistent with a struggle. The gash on her head wasn't from a slip and fall. It was from being struck, and the position of her body in the dry tub. It didn't make sense for an accidental drowning. Kathleen Savio had been killed, and the most likely suspect? Her ex-husband, Drew Peterson. On May 7, 2009, nearly 5 years after Kathleen's death, Drew Peterson was arrested and charged with her murder. He pleaded not guilty. He maintained his innocence. He claimed this was all a witch hunt, that he was being railroaded because people didn't like him. But the evidence told a different story. At trial, prosecutors laid out a damning case. They presented Kathleen's history of abuse. They showed the orders of protection, the police reports, the documented threats. They brought in witnesses who testified that Kathy had been terrified of Drew. And then, they did something controversial. They used hearsay evidence. Normally, hearsay, statements made outside of court, isn't allowed in trials. But Illinois had passed a law, later nicknamed Drew's Law, that allowed hearsay evidence in cases where the defendant was suspected of killing the witness. Stacy Peterson's statements, the things she'd told her pastor about the night Kathleen died, were allowed into evidence. The jury heard how Drew had left that night with clean clothes and returned with bloody ones. How Stacy believed he had murdered Kathleen. How she had been terrified. On September 6, 2012, after deliberating for nearly 14 hours, the jury reached a verdict. Guilty. Drew Peterson was convicted of first-degree murder in the death of Kathleen Savio. He was sentenced to 38 years in prison. But the story doesn't end there. Even behind bars, Drew Peterson couldn't let go of his need for control. In 2015, while serving his sentence, Drew was caught trying to arrange a hit. He wanted to kill the prosecutor who had convicted him, Will County State's Attorney James Glasgow. Drew reached out to a fellow inmate, offered him money, promised him a share of a hidden stash if he would kill Glasgow. But that inmate? He was working with authorities. The entire conversation was recorded. In 2016, Drew Peterson was convicted again. This time, for solicitation of murder. He received an additional 40 years in prison. Today, Drew Peterson is 70 years old. He's serving his sentence at an Indiana state prison. If he lives long enough, he won't be eligible for parole until he's 92 years old. Here's the tragic reality. Stacy Peterson has never been found. Despite extensive searches, despite countless tips and leads, despite years of investigation, Stacy has simply vanished. Her family believes she's dead. Investigators believe she's dead. Most people believe Drew killed her and disposed of her body. But without a body, without physical evidence, prosecutors have never been able to charge Drew with Stacy's murder. Stacy's family still holds out hope. They still search. They still wait for answers. But as the years go by, those answers seem more and more unlikely. Stacy Peterson was 23 years old when she disappeared. She left behind 2 young sons. And somewhere, wherever she is, she deserves justice too. The Drew Peterson case changed American law. Drew's Law, the legislation that allowed hearsay evidence in his trial, set a precedent. It showed that even when a killer silences their victim, their voice can still be heard in court. It also shone a light on something we don't talk about enough: the danger of ignoring warning signs. Kathleen Savio told everyone who would listen that Drew was going to kill her. She filed reports. She begged for help. And still, nothing was done until it was too late. How many times do we hear stories like this? How many times do we hear about women who were afraid, who spoke up, who were ignored, until they ended up dead? The Drew Peterson case is a reminder that we need to listen, that we need to take threats seriously, that we need to believe victims when they say they're in danger. Because sometimes, by the time we finally pay attention, it's already too late. Drew Peterson thought he was untouchable. He thought his badge, his charm, his position would protect him forever. He thought he could get away with murder. And for a while he did. But the truth has a way of coming out. Justice has a way of catching up. And today, Drew Peterson sits in a cell, right where he belongs. If this story affected you, if it made you think, if it reminded you of the importance of speaking up and listening, then share this video. Let's spread awareness. Let's make sure stories like Kathleen's and Stacy's are never forgotten. And don't forget to comment below with what state you're watching from. We love building this community with you, right here on American Shadow. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and we'll see you in the next story. Stay safe out there, everyone. And remember, sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones hiding in plain sight.